Let me get my screen share going and get things off. All righty. So I believe every presentation should start with some memes. So here's this one that I'm going to start with. This is the Become Ungovernable meme. If you've never seen it, the slogan is associated with anarchism and other sort of movements of that style. But back in ye old 2020, it became a meme of sort of animals and other sort of unusual situations, breaking social norms, doing something impractical in a setting that's otherwise pretty ordinary. And while this meme is silly, I, in particular, as a scuba diver, love the one where the person is scuba diving in the world's smallest pool that says no diving next to it. I started to have this phrase keep coming back into my head as I was reflecting on sort of how I've seen companies approach governance over the years, because there are some organizations that I've worked with that really embrace governance. They understand the importance of content operations. They're documenting workflows, roles, responsibilities, guidelines, systems, process, all that kind of stuff. They're really focused on streamlining their current activities and opening new opportunities for growth. But a lot of the organizations that I've worked with seem to have become ungovernable as their motto. They de-scope governance conversations from projects and they leave relevant stakeholders out of ideation sessions and reference internal communication challenges, but then don't seem to hear themselves that that's a blocker to progress. Um, and I get it because governance is hard and people are messy and not all processes within your sphere of influence. Um, when a workflow is fractured and the legacy of a silo is really strong, it feels a lot of times easier to add a technology solution than to try to figure out how to do more with less, or to figure out how to do more with less rather than facilitate open conversation among teams who actually control the individual elements of that process. And a lot of organizations, of course, don't have sort of a culture of psychological safety that would scaffold those conversations anyway. That means that teams often feel that they have enough on their plates. They don't want to add new collaborators. They don't want to be slowed down, especially if those collaborators have different priorities on their roadmap or different KPIs that they have to answer to. So, I'll say it again, governance is hard because people and organizations are messy. I personally would love for every stakeholder or client to, kick off their content strategy initiatives with a proven governance model in hand, with documented workflows, swim lane systems to support those structures. But that is rare. Sometimes that's because they don't know that it's key to tackling the actual problem. Sometimes it's because the organization just doesn't invest in process over something like technology or even in design. That said, regardless, even in the absence of a governance model, we still have content strategies and structures to develop, folks in this space, right? When I was working in kind of agency land, my scope was usually geared towards upgrading my client's platform to a newer version or moving from one content management system, CMS, to another. But sometimes it also included a full redesign. And either way, I was almost always on the hook for a content model. I know that everybody sort of has their own path to content. So if content modeling is not part of your practice yet, picture basically a way to document and communicate specifications for how content needs to be structured from the field level all the way up to larger pieces of content so that a developer can then kind of build an authoring experience that makes the user-facing experience come to life. So it's kind of pairing the two in my mind, or at least that was the practice that I was using for content modeling. So all of this comes together in my true intro of how might we use a content model to kind of put some band-aids over governance challenges. How can we support the effective, consistent, and efficient creation and entry of content into your shiny new CMS or your shiny new web design, even when sort of the people and process side of the transformation is off the table, which in a lot of projects and cases it is. I love to dive right in, which means that then I usually have to back up and do an intro. So let me do that. I'll introduce myself here. As Paula said, I'm Sabina Leybold. I've been doing content strategy and sort of adjacent activities for more than 8 years. Um, it's almost entirely been in experience design teams at agencies, um, usually focused on things like digital transformation and sort of software and design. But some of it has ranged from copywriting to editorial strategy and personalization, that kind of stuff, all the way to IA and UX. And until a few months ago, I worked at an agency called Jacala, where I was, still responsible for IA and UX work, but my clients increasingly needed support to manage migration planning and execution from traditional CMSs, monolithic CMSs to headless ones, right? So again, you don't have to be a super expert in either of those things if you aren't, to get something out of this, but it became a big passion for me as I became more and more immersed in structured content and in content modeling specifically. That whole journey was a massive learning curve. So if you're on it, I see you, I feel you, solidarity. But I really came to enjoy thinking deeply about the authoring experience as I shifted into more of a kind of a content architect role, where my job was to focus on demystifying and organizing complex data into systems to make them manageable and intuitive. So recently, I went in-house for a nonprofit holding company called Imperium and its administrative shared services provider called APIS Services, which means that now the content architect is also the content author. So it has remained just as personal for me. We're building the thing that then we need to be using, right? So even though you'll see today's case study and also all the slide branding is all kind of from my Jacala days. So if you are Googling on the side, you'll see that come through. Um, but the goal today is to share a couple de-identified examples from a client in the healthcare industry. And knowing that it's healthcare really takes the challenges of content modeling and governance, like dials them up to 11 as folks who've worked with healthcare clients or who are client side in-house in healthcare know. You know that there's layers of complexity and regulation, right? Flexibility can be a little bit more limited in content operations in particular, above and beyond the regular mess of being imperfect people with imperfect communication, doing our best at imperfect workplaces, right? So hopefully this will be fun for you. It was for me to put it together, but without further ado, we'll dive into some of the tactics. When I was a kid, my parents would tell me that if my friends were pressuring me into something I didn't want to do, I could use them as an excuse to skip out on doing so. So when I was a consultant, I would often tell my clients something very similar. If there's a content related conversation you need to have with your internal stakeholders, your business units, your cross-functional counterparts, whoever it is, but you're struggling to approach it, you can tell them it's a dependency for my work, even if it's not. And a lot of times that was very transformative. It is expensive to hire an agency. So when I was on that side, the rationale of we're paying for it, so we need to make the most of it, became sort of a strong motivator among my clients, even in cultures where collaboration and governance were lower priorities or even bordered on taboo. And even if you're not agency, right, because this came from an agency case study that has a little bit of flavors throughout, but even if you're content modeling in-house, the very act of structuring data, or either for the first time or for restructuring it later, making it work better, that can be a very radical or a very radical act, actually. Content modeling is an opportunity to think bigger, to think more cross-functionally, to think in new ways if your organization has not been focused on how things actually go from being built kind of in the backside of things, right? The CMS, and how that translates into a user experience. Content modeling successfully requires discussing content goals, discussing barriers to achieving them, opportunities to streamline management, work towards a single source of truth in a lot of cases, and establishing CMS roles and permissions. Sorry, I'm getting a little thing on the side. Okay. Uh, all of those sort of discussion topics and important points delve into not just the content, but the human side of content, right? So governance concerns and considerations a lot of times come up when talking about things like, what do we want? Why haven't we achieved them already? How are we going to get to that together? In that way, working towards structured content and documenting the outcomes of the conversations that drive that structure can serve as the first step towards improvements to workflow. So that means that even just having the conversation is taking the first step. And once you've taken that first step, it can feel a lot less intimidating to directly tackle operations that boost, the impact of the content model and support the return on investment for it, which for some people is the reason that they're doing it in the first place. So when my client, once again, they're in healthcare, they brought me and my team on. Luckily, they already understood the impact of a content model on deep and transformative initiatives across the organization. We didn't have to do the buy-in. Were already ready. They were ready to jump in onto the project, right? They wanted to rethink everything, but they still had a lot of immediate content structure priorities and definitely governance challenges. So, someday they really wanted to do things like optimize for personalization and other kind of more advanced tactics, but they're in healthcare. This is a hospital system. The number one priority, it doesn't matter if anything else gets done, their number one priority is ensuring that patients can schedule and attend appointments easily. It's the purpose of the organization, it's their main source of revenue. So that makes the content implications very clear, right? The information about appointments in particular needs to be accessible and it needs to be accurate no matter what. That means the foundation, the content model behind it becomes important too. And so when we began workshopping, and this is, like I said, de-identified, but this is actual sticky notes from our conversations and our workshops, we began to uncover challenges that made the simple concept of get patients to appointments, it became much murkier than I think any of us really thought. So there's a couple ways in which this came to fruition, and you'll see a little bit of it hinted at here in my arrows and my stars and whatever. But departments and locations had name variations based on channel requirements or based on brand relationships. So consistency was very tricky. Clinics move addresses a lot. If you've ever been to a doctor that moved, you know how that goes. They do it a lot. And providers, even without sort of an actual clinic move, even providers will shift between practices. Sometimes they'll be at multiple locations. So all of that information needs to be available ASAP when it changes everywhere it appears. So that's their website. They have a geofence beacon enabled app that would take you turn by turn inside the hospital. They have an EMR, electronic medical record system. And then there's, even things like ads, right? So it becomes very complex very quickly. And of course, none of these platforms like to talk to each other and they all structure data in different ways. Then they also, of course, all have different publishing processes and notification systems and automation abilities or lack thereof. So the question that my clients were desperate to answer was, what's our single source of truth? And then following on to that, can we even have a single source of truth? How do we make that work for us? All of those questions and all of the sources of the challenges that spurred them came down to a mix of technical, content structure, and governance types of solutions. But the only major deliverable of the project that I was working on was the content model. There was no dedicated time to discuss or document governance strategies, even though that was a big part of the problem, which made me realize how structure on its own can't solve everything. And in fact, it can't solve anything if it's not being used by people in the intended way. So I discovered that even when governance gets descoped, the need for it doesn't disappear. And that means you have to get a little subversive and bring the spirit of governance into the content model itself. So we're going to look at that a little bit more. Before you can sort of reach the mystical land of a single source of truth, you have to go through the process, which can sometimes be daunting, of making things consistent. And the first stop there is specific and reusable content, right? This is one of our sneaky governance tactics as we aim to structure the content. We help people establish priorities without knowing it. I have found that a lot of clients can get spooked by the P word of priority. But the question of does this need to be reused actually does effectively ask just that. Why would an organization care about having a single source of truth if all of the content is bespoke, right? The vision of the single source of truth, which is again what the client came to us for, is a vision in service of avoiding duplication of work. It's in service of managing version control, and then, of course, the sort of magic wand consistency across large amounts of content. So, when discussing the value and efficiency of content reusability, it's crucial to also assess those risks that come with it, right? If we rely on structures and systems for scalability, that means more work up front to decontextualize that content, and then a bit less control on a case by case basis, right? So the question, does this need to be reused, becomes the content strategist's magic question. It speaks to that trade-off of which content transformed into, sort of granular decontextualized data is worth the risk of that trade-off, right? Where are we going to focus our work to structure, label, and validate content attributes because the value of doing so exceeds the effort of doing so? And oops, there you go. That's a priority. You don't have to pay any attention to the governance behind the curtain when it comes to something like that. So, if their goal is a single source of truth, then we can begin to move forward with aggregating and structuring data attributes to appropriately populate what they call a content expression, which, could be a page, could be an ad, could be all sorts of things in a headless system, right? What I haven't sort of explicitly said here is that this is really for a headless system. They're moving to contentful specifically. So if you're working on contentful anything, this is, you know how this goes. In the case of this hospital system, the horror story that they told us was that anytime the PR team needed a boilerplate description of a department, they would write a new one, pieced together from like website content, past press releases, other promotional materials. They didn't have any sort of standard, and it wasn't fun for anybody. So, when we were looking to expand the content model, we wanted to use their headless CMS, in this case, Contentful, as the source of truth for department information, all department information, even if that content was never planned to be displayed in a digital context, in this case, a corresponding web page, right? So that means that the PR team can also use this platform as a content repository to go into the entry for that department, pull the boilerplate, and put it into an editorial piece. And then if someday they wanted to publish that content that they've written on the site directly, they can simply add like a reference token onto a new page that would pull in the most recent version of the description from the department essentially repository from the entry. So that prevents retyping, copy paste errors. And of course, if the description ever changes, they don't have to sort of go through and know everywhere that that boilerplate text had been used and then manually update it everywhere, which is way more fun. And that's why they wanted to move to sort of that reusability model. That work that we were doing for horror stories like that laid the foundation towards making, the CMS the central connector for all the other systems. So integrating databases for provider locations and patient education resources, things like that. No longer would a clinic's hours have to get updated on both the website and in the location database. Instead, it could be done centrally and then distributed automatically, to those other platforms. I want to be realistic because we haven't talked a ton specifically about governance, right? That exact situation that I just described doesn't actually solve the governance challenges that create source of truth problems. People still need to use the platform in the way we design it to be used, and adoption can be tricky. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But the value and efficiency of unified content management is very persuasive when the alternative is like hunting and pecking all over the website to find a two-sentence department description that hopefully somebody wrote once upon a time. So that brings us to the actual crafting of the content model and thinking through the authoring experience. This is sort of the bulk of the tactics that we're going to go through. In this case, my client had a somewhat decentralized team of content editors, and they were only planning to increase the number of people who had access to their CMS. Like we talked about, now the PR team would have access, even though they're not publishing anything digitally. So, when you add more people, who knows what they might get up to? That's the governance problem, right? That we all find ourselves in here. Obviously, the best case scenario would be to create and undergo, extensive content training, fully documented guidelines. I would have loved to have that be scoped. But the next best thing is really the thing that got me thinking about this talk in the first place, which is, designing a CMS architecture that gives guidance and prevents errors in situ for an editor. So these are a couple of the ways that we went about this, right? The first is determining appropriate field types, so reducing free text whenever possible. One example of this is the hospital, was shifting from free text to describe the parking at a clinic. Instead of sometimes it says parking on the side of the building, free self park, um, there is parking available, like all sorts of wild stuff that is there in the free text to just a combination. A drop down essentially of combinations of free versus paid and self park versus valet. So we don't need all of the possible ways to describe it. Simply those two attributes are the most important. Then ensuring field names are consistent and meaningful across the system. So we spent a lot of time updating description fields to be more granular and specific. So rather than it just saying, here's the description of this concept, this idea, sometimes it would have a summary, which has a more factual information to it. So describing a department in more of a factual or informative type of way, separate from a value proposition field, which allows for some marketing language. We're leaders in X, Y, and Z, we're award winning in this type of thing. So those text strings could either live alone, a page with a summary or a blog post with a value proposition, or they could travel together, right? So you could say, here's the name of the department, and here's both the informative and the sort of persuasive description of them together. In addition to that, right, help text can be huge. I know that especially content designers who are writing things like help text, this is, preaching to the choir here, but providing guidance on what should and shouldn't be in a given field. And then, of course, when appropriate, using enabling validation and ensuring formatting and rules are actually followed. So we did a lot of sort of describing, not just, again, thinking about the value proposition and the summary. We wrote what the difference between those things are in the help text so that that information was never far away. And then, of course, carefully establishing editing permissions, right? So making them narrow in some cases to lock down kind of challenging or sensitive content, or broad in others. Especially when you are in the land of reusable content, you will want to think about who gets to change the things that can get applied beyond just the one place that they kind of think of it as being. But you also, of course, want to allow as much flexibility as you truly need to. So the great thing about these kind of specific tactics is that if the group that you are working with, whether that's internal or external, is down to talk about governance, great. Like, let's use conversations about field names and the guidelines that you put into help text and permission levels and things like that to push forward with the concurrent, definition and refinement of roles and workflow. But if you have stakeholders who are governance avoidant, you can easily disguise the conversation around this as elements of a content model. So you can say, how does this help text sound? Would it be helpful to add validation here to avoid errors? Perhaps only this subsection of the team should be able to create new tags, stuff like that. They don't necessarily have to think of it as being capital G governance, which is scary, in order to get the most out of the actual tactics that you are using to help reinforce the system. I want to add here that change is notoriously hard. I think we all know this. This is why a lot of governance models include process to evaluate and address needs that might arise. So if you can design your content model to weather change, that can help to smooth that workflow a little bit too, with or without a fully documented process about when and how that happens. So the first step again is to, figure out where changes are anticipated. If you work in-house, you might already kind of know which data feels like a revolving door. But if you're a consultant or in an agency context, you'll need really a strong background in how the business works. Since, I'm sure it will not sound unfamiliar that business priorities and politics are often actually the thing driving content updates, not necessarily, UX or technology best practices, sometimes not even user research or true user needs, right? So my clients in this scenario mentioned frequently changing content areas when I asked about pain points up front in sort of that Venn diagram approach that we were talking about. But if you have, if you encounter somebody who doesn't really volunteer information, you can start to get at this by asking. To me, the magic question here is how certain information gets determined, right? So, how do products and services get their names? How often do their descriptions, their attributes, their specs, how often do those things change? And what factors actually cause that change? Those become the ways that you get at, is this something that is pretty static or pretty permanent, whether or not you're in charge of that change, right? As either the consultant or the content strategist on it. Um, I mentioned briefly that there was sort of like challenges with name variations for departments. So, in after several conversations about naming conventions broadly and sort of when, in what context, that kind of stuff, we determined that each department, instead of having one name field, would need several. Um, so they needed the longest name, inclusive of the hospital system's name, a trademark sign, and the department's name. So for now, that would actually get imported from Epic, which is their EHR, electronic health record system. Eventually, the plan was to kind of let Contentful be the source of truth there, but in the meantime, there was an integration, right? Then, stored in Contentful, we would have department short name, which is the shorter name of the department. It mostly just removed the hospital system's branding and the trademark sign as well. And this was kind of to be used in certain scenarios, right? And then optionally, there would be the addition of the sponsored name or the nickname of the department. So for a department like cardiology, maybe they would call it the Heart Center, sort of colloquially, and they would want to use that in certain places. Or if there were a sponsorship relationship, right, maybe it's the John Smith Heart Center. That last one in particular was something that was important to unlock because sponsor relationships were the most likely to change on a semi-regular basis and were a key business priority because it's a major revenue stream, right? So combing through their site anytime there was a change in sponsorship to find and replace all mentions of a previous sponsor's name and move it to the new sponsor was both a major pain point, but also majorly important politically. So in moving to Contentful, we were able to restructure the department data to allow for this like token style content control when those changes occurred. But we would not have gotten at that if we did not ask what is likely to change. How can we set this up for you? This came out of, like I said, conversations about which data needed to be reusable. So when I'm talking about like that's your key to priority conversations, that's really a good one. Versus, what can exist in a single location. So what types of information is subject to change? Let's model for it. And then we again discovered semi-regular change in locations data. Again, I hinted at this earlier. Your doctor used to be down the street and now they're across town. And the accuracy of that location data is kind of the live or die of whether you get to your appointment, right? So major priority there too. Uh, Again, horror story that organizational challenges and workflows and things meant that the web team might find out about a location change either well in advance, weeks, months, or they might find out about it literally the day before. And so then when that cutover needed to happen, it also needed to happen quickly and everywhere across the platform. So among, complications about locations, we had to get creative. So I architected a model where a clinic entry, so the information about a given clinic referenced actually a separate content type that stored its address and contact info. If you're not super familiar with Contentful, that's just, it means basically you're storing those things separate from each other rather than saying, oh, the phone number and the address belong to the clinic. Instead, it's sort of built in a separate way. And then you tell the clinic to say, hey, by the way, that's the address and the phone number you need, right? That would be an unusual way to structure this, except for in this scenario where they needed to not limit a clinic actually to only one address, but they needed the field for its location to allow multiple references so that you could have a new clinic location and an old clinic location, accompanying help text, right? So talking about the power of help text. We wanted to have that field say, you should only use a single location reference, except for if you're moving. This is an exception. You can add a second one in so that then when the time came to do that cutover, they could literally just schedule a publish and an unpublish, right? So unpublish the old, publish the new. So editors, if they had advanced access, to that information could set that up in advance, and they didn't have to get up at 2 in the morning to do that cutover themselves manually anymore. So even though it's an odd structure, it made a lot of people very happy, even though it was a little bit complicated on paper, right? So the system could work whether they had a lot of notice or a little bit of notice. And then scheduling that to happen simultaneously means that there was never any risk of old information staying out there when new information needed to be out there instead, right? So we could make it happen automatically. Sometimes you might encounter a team that doesn't have or want formal governance guidelines. That's always the one that confounds me is when they don't want it. But they may still have workflow requirements. So again, this is healthcare, more interest, more scrutiny, and sort of like legal and regulatory contexts. And one stakeholder group on this project was my client's patient education team. They handle both print and digital materials that get reviewed every 3 years to ensure that they're accurate and thorough and up to date with medical advancements, and then also appropriate for each audience. So when we discussed with them, we asked whether there were any features that would make the 3 year review cycle a little simpler for them, even though that was going to happen totally separately in another realm, another platform. But we came to a handful of fields that would support internal attribute tagging, ID and author labeling, and then most interestingly, a custom date created field. Even though Contentful and other platforms automatically store timestamp data for creation and updates, the patient education team specifically wanted manual entry of that date to support customization so that it could align with their review cycle, right? So they wanted something custom for a reason that actually had nothing to do with the platform, but it still served that single source of truth goal. And to me, in closing, that example is a great reminder that there is no overtly right or wrong way to build a system, the best content model, the best integrations are never one size fits all. You find some teams are really buttoned up and others are ungovernable, or at least seem that way. But the idea of trying to fit the messiness of people into a rigid content model rarely works, right? So I hope that you leave this session and as we move into Q&A, that it has sparked some ways that you feel like you can tailor what you're designing and what you're building to fit a reality, even if it's not a perfect reality, and then to work to kind of improve it for your content editors, your stakeholders, or even yourself, if now, like me, you are also the content author in addition to the content structure God, and to do that kind of just one field at a time and bite it off like that. So, to that end, I will take any questions that you have. And if you need me to skip back to anything, I am happy to.
Mm. Well, will we see if any questions are coming in the chat? I actually have one.
Yeah,
Actually, I have a
please.
couple. So I am curious about kind of what the reception of this work was with the
Yeah.
with the content authors, and if it's you may have mentioned this, and if so, I apologize that I missed it.
Yeah.
Like how long ago you developed this
Mm.
structure? Is it up and running, and do you have any kind of information about how well it's working and how well people have adopted and
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a question with both smiles and frowns, or at least the answer is. So the happy side of it is that everybody was very, very thrilled with the structure, right? Like I said, things like not having to get up at 2 in the morning to do a cutover, like it seems
guys?
simple, but
Yeah.
like truly that is like the human impact of it works well for your system. Same deal, right? Like the idea of not having to kind of go and isolate information and do the hunting and pecking, all that kind of stuff. So everybody, I would say the reception of the content model in a theoretical way, thrilled. Everybody was very happy. When I finished my portion of the project, uh, the trick was something that I don't think any of us were necessarily predicting, but maybe we, in hindsight, should have, which is that moving from their existing system, which was IBM's Wickham
Mm.
WCM, if you know that product, they're moving from there to Contentful. And there was some reason that was not initially provided to us as we were consulting through the content model. Um, there was some reason that all of a sudden they needed to get off of Wickham like immediately.
Mm,
But it wasn't something, originally it was like, yeah, we'll get off of it in the next year. It'll be great. And then it was like, no, we're getting off of it like in the next month or two. And so what
yikes.
that meant was they have this big, beautiful content model that they love and they're really excited about, and they want it Contentful to be set up for them so that they can do this and all this kind of stuff. But they basically had to do a half step
Mm,
when sort of my piece of the project was done, which is moving essentially the
mm,
structure that they have in Wickham today into Contentful just so that they can do a plane migration, like as close to a lift and shift as is humanly possible,
right, right.
just to basically dump everything into Contentful and leave Wickham behind. But the plan, as far as like I said, when I sort of left off on this project, was to be moving towards more of these types of structures because, again, it offers something that they were all really looking to move towards and that would make a big human impact for them. So, yay and nay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I could see that. I could see another challenge with that, given that, if people need to learn a new content management system, so they
Yeah.
may need training around that, but they're
Mhm.
learning it in a in a model that is not where they're going. So there's going to potentially be retraining, right?
Yes. Yeah. And there was definitely anticipation of training there. And in fact, the initial plan was not to migrate any content from Wickham at all. The plan was to rebuild everything in Contentful so
Mm,
that we would be sort of like building it the right way. You know what I mean?
mm,
And that would, of course, also be training. It would be a chance to kind of like, not totally start fresh, but to reevaluate and refresh things that had been on their site. Like that was the plan, right? Um,
right.
Unfortunately, the piece when I was sort of like done with this was like almost hearsay where I was like, what had to happen? Like and that's, but like I said, that's the reality of the situation, right?
Right,
So,
right.
um, it is interesting. There's an alternate universe where I give the same talk, but it's me trying to transform the Wickham version of Contentful, right, into this thing that is the same, hopefully, end product. But would that have changed the process? Maybe a little, but ultimately, at the end of the day, I think a lot of the things that we talked about with them and planned with them would have held firm, right? So,
Mm,
things like, can we reduce training by having more help text? Because you're sort of training on the fly, right? That type of approach is something that we were going towards because they were looking to open up more content editors. So, yes, all of agreed, Paula, all of those things 100%. And it's an imperfect
yeah.
system. So,
Yeah, right. Well,
yeah.
I think, raise your hand if you've been in that situation, right, where
Yeah,
a
always.
migration happened before the cleanup and the modeling could be done.
Exactly.
So I think
Yeah, and
it's
I
actually
mean, look,
fairly
they
typical.
knew that that wasn't the right way to do it, and then, like I said, something happened that, frankly, I don't know. I'm not even trying to hold it close to my chest. I literally don't know what happened. That all of a sudden it was
Yeah,
like, we're, screw ideal state, we're going with messy state, and that is happens all the time, and we have
yeah,
all been
yeah,
there. Yeah.
yeah. So, and sorry, if does anyone else have questions? I'm not seeing anything coming in. Well, then my other question is sort of what's sort of the biggest challenge with this, right? In terms of,
Yeah.
designing this model and, obviously healthcare, highly regulated industry, very
Yeah.
complicated, as you said, huge, huge consequences if you get something wrong and people can't find their clinic or whatever. But
Yeah.
what would you say was sort of the biggest challenge of this project?
For myself, the biggest problem, or the biggest challenge rather, was that I didn't know Contentful at all when I
Mm,
started the project. So, in some ways that I think made me a more empathetic modeler in this scenario, like because when you're talking about training and you're talking about bringing in editors on, to be transforming content, kind of once they have the system that they need. I have never been more challenged by a project ever in my career because I
mm,
just genuinely walked in without really knowing. Without, Contentful is structured very different than other CMSs. Increasingly, a lot of, the even the sort of monolithic types of CMSs. I had worked a lot in Drupal before then. I had worked in WordPress, things like that, that are very traditional, and are kind of, you edit it the place where you know it's going to be. And if you have to repeat it
Hmm.
later, you're copying and pasting, right? Like that's the typical kind of authoring experience. So for me to be both teaching myself Contentful while consulting them on Contentful, while sort of dealing with, yes, there's regulation. That I would say was the hardest thing. So again, this is where I mentioned big learning curve in the beginning. And if you're there, boy, howdy, I feel you. This project nearly broke me. But it
Yeah.
also is like one of the coolest things I think I've gotten to do because I do think it really put me in the same mindset as my clients in a lot of ways because yes,
Mm,
I have expertise in sort of overall structure and I got to spend almost a year totally focused on this, right? And that's rare actually an agency to mostly be working on one client for quite some
yeah,
time.
yeah, yeah,
Um, so I had the brain space to be working through that, and that was great. In some ways, it kind of mimicked like being another member of their team, and I think that that helped a lot with sort of the end product. At the same time, it is one of the hardest things I've ever had to
yeah,
do.
yeah,
But
yeah,
now I'm
yeah,
like, great, I could do it again, and it would be fine because it wouldn't be the first time that I'd done it. So I don't know, especially if
yeah,
people are entering 2026 being like, hey, I want to grow my skills, but it feels scary and uncomfortable and whatever. Like here I am 2 years out giving a talk about, hey, it actually went about as well as I could have hoped. And in some ways, all of my fears feel silly now in retrospect, but in the moment, it was like, it felt impossible. It felt totally insurmountable. So
yeah, yeah. So
I,
sort of
I
welcome
see
to
you.
consulting, right? Yeah, yeah. Which
Exactly,
is, of
exactly. Yeah,
course, the good side of consulting is you're constantly learning new tools
yeah,
and new industries, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
looks like we've got a question from Christy asking, do you know the direct patient impacts of the new system?
I wish I did. Yeah, unfortunately, I am no longer even at the company, but I
Mm,
had been off, like I'd been done with the project for about a year by the time I departed in the fall. So I don't have access to any of that. And I think some of it hasn't even totally been launched based on the state of where things were when I last heard about them. But the tricky thing is, unless I have that insider information, um, by being the consultant, like hypothetically, I will never know if they've done their restructure
mm,
on the CMS side because you can't really tell from from the user experience, except for maybe like the parking scenario. I'm like, that feels like an easy thing I could look up, but I don't know, right? Like, I don't know whether that actually saves, okay, think about the actual metrics that would be good there. Time saved at the appointment, more appointments, made as opposed to, well, more appointments scheduled and then fewer missed, right? Is sort of the KPIs there. But better, better satisfaction scores, more retention with a doctor or a clinic or a provider, any of that kind of stuff. So yeah, I would also love to know, especially the patient education stuff, because they were moving from very like old school, we hand you a PDF or we hand you a printout when you're in the office, and even getting them to go to a PDF was like a big jump, and then let alone to get them to sort of digitize it. I think there's huge opportunities for, you know, if you lose a piece of paper about about your medical treatment, having a digital version can actually be a huge like health outcome as well. So yeah, I
yeah.
wish I knew, Christy. Unfortunately, I don't. But yeah.
And are you doing similar work now that you are sort of in-house versus that consulting role? Are you doing modeling and
Um, so it's a totally new job, not just to me, but it was also created so that I would fill it. So it's the whole thing is kind of a new frontier. Um, and one of the cool things about my new job is that it's actually in health and human services to some extent. But it is in-house, but one of my jobs in-house is to kind of create an in-house agency for the nonprofits that are united under this kind of consolidation model. So there may be some additional content modeling that I get to do as part of that. In particular, there's a couple that like they offer proprietary telehealth, and so integrating their existing websites, which a lot of times they're kind of older and outdated, as nonprofit sites in particular tend to be, moving towards, hey, we want sort of a newer technology, a new functionality. Like there may be more of those opportunities. Do I know how to model for telehealth? No, but I didn't know how to model for any of those things before this thing,
Right.
before this project. So I think if anything, it has given me the confidence to take on a project where I genuinely have no idea when stepping into it. So yeah, it's cool.
That's great.
It's a very different position, but I hope to continue to do content modeling because I really did fall in love with it. So it'll be a different scope, but still cool.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
is fascinating. Well, and I have to say, because I think I mentioned, I'm working on a project right now where governance is one of the work streams. And, we've done some content modeling, we're redesigning templates, and it's going to be, how does all of this stuff get managed? But
Mm,
um, fortunately, I think in this case, the clients are perfectly comfortable with the big G word, governance.
yeah.
But often they're not, obviously. So I love your idea of sort of stealth governance via the content model. I think that's really clever.
Yeah,
Uh,
for sure. And if there are stealth ways to get out all of the other challenges of this world, I'm all ears. So you all let me know how to stealth do everything else that we need to do to fight the good fight in content. So.
I just wanted to
All
mention
right.
really quickly that the blog post that was linked in the
Oh
chat
yeah.
from Uniform,
Yeah.
it has a really great link to examples of content modeling for anybody who doesn't, isn't too
Mm,
terribly familiar with that. And I'll throw it in the chat as well for folks. But
Yeah.
as I was kind of going down the rabbit hole with that, content modeling to me is super fascinating. I'm drawn to anything that's like structure and organization. So I've been really diving into like structured content and content modeling, and that world, so much of the information and resources you see
Yeah.
can get super technical and super
Yes.
nerdy.
Yeah.
So that's why I wanted to link this article, is that it is actually understandable. So
Yes.
anybody who's interested in that, take a
Yes.
look.
Yeah. Yeah, they
nice.
do.
Yeah.
They
Thanks
have some
for
really good
digging this
content
out.
there. The trick with content modeling is because it's so specific to every sort of use case, it can
Yes.
be really hard. I mean, this is why when I walked into this project, I was like, I have no idea because there's really
Yeah.
not any good like how-to guides. It's a lot of like, and then think about this other thing. And you're like, how am I supposed to think about that thing? But I don't know anything about it, So I
Well, and like
agree,
you
Ariel, that
said,
anytime there's like a really good, clear resource, like we got to be spreading it widely.
I agree.
Awesome.
And like you said, so much of it hinges on really getting to know the client or the company that you're working
Mhm.
with,
Yeah.
and understanding their uses and their needs, and all of the information delivery channels. So
Yeah.
it's definitely a research heavy and knowledge heavy
Yeah.
kind of a task. But that's one of the things I also liked. I worked in the agency world for quite some time,
Yeah.
and I did enjoy that fast ramp up. I
Oh,
enjoyed
yeah.
getting to learn about all sorts of different companies, and like, Paula was just talking about learning new skills all the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
So yeah, it
And
was
in
that
some
that part was
ways,
great.
yeah, and in some ways it's funny actually learning the contentful part of all of this was it was daunting. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to minimize that it was incredibly difficult, but learning what questions to ask is the harder thing in my mind, right? Because
Mhm.
hypothetically, I can learn any technology that, like it takes time, but it's something that tends to have more how-tos and tends to have more tutorials. There's not a ton of tutorials of like, okay, what questions do you actually need to know in order to figure out what thing you need to do to technology at the end of it, which is why I wanted to focus a lot on like, here are the questions to be asking. So
Yep,
hopefully folks found that helpful because I
super
agree, Ariel,
helpful.
there's a lot of opportunities to be learning all sorts of new things, but kind of like having a roadmap of like, I don't even know what I don't know. So like at least let's start with what questions should I be asking? Because that's kind of the first step in my mind to getting at the answers.
So
Yeah,
important.
that's great.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
a really good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect.
All right. Well, unless there are any last minute, Marcia, welcome to my world. Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Any last minute questions? Please join us in thanking Sabina. This was really an excellent
Thank you.
presentation, great topic. I learned a lot. I hope everyone else did too. And again, keep an eye on all of the content strategy, Seattle socials and LinkedIn and so on. Join us at an event in the future, please. Mm,
Yeah,
Thanks,
next
everyone.
up February.
yes. All right.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you,
Good night,
everybody.
everyone. Thank you for
Bye.
coming.
Bye.